Welcome back. This is, I think, part four of a, I think, five-part series. So we'll see how long this goes. But I want to continue the conversation in regards to the way how this impacts um, women in particular, particularly women of color. So I talked about a few things earlier. The mujer villana, right, the Spanish woman who takes care of the household while her husband's out there fighting. Now that's important because you have to understand that when some of these men died out in the battlefield, what they would do is try to get some of the things that he used for war at that moment. So like the sword and the shield, the troops would try to collect that, and then they would take it back to this person's partner, his wife, and they would return them, kind of symbolizing this kind of continuation of the struggle to the next generation. So they would take up this fight during La Reconquista. So, with Christianity and this concept of monogamy and marriage and legitimacy, this begins to impact other groups of people, particularly women of color, and I'll talk about that now. So, as I know, we saw earlier, only about 36% of women were being enslaved. And early on, it wasn't large numbers. It wasn't too much later where women started to come in larger numbers, or at least not come, but be enslaved in larger numbers. And what happens is, in this process, women of color begin to be eroticized, sexualized by these colonial people. So there's a great article in one of the books that I've read with Caribbean women where the manager of this field is writing about the workforce, who's mostly women. I forgot what they were picking, but they're picking some kind of vegetable or something out in the Caribbean, and he begins to kind of describe their bodies in very kind of sexual ways, but very racialized ways too, talking about their butts, talking about their breast, how they bent over to pick up this fruit, and he could see their breast swing and things like that in a very kind of animalistic, but a very sexual animalistic way. So this is what I'm going to address now as to what happens to these women as this ideology of colonization begins to take shape in the Americas. Well, in Western culture, again, this is within this time frame, there's certain ideas when we talk about honor and virtue that are associated with women. So when we talk about honor and virtue with men, it's completely different than the way we describe it for women. For men, it's mostly associated with these concepts of manhood and warfare and things like that. Whereas with women, a woman's honor is associated with her reproductive ability, right? A woman's honor is directly connected to her uterus in Western culture. And you probably heard some of these terms like, oh, you got to protect your honor. So if you tell it to a man, that's completely different from when you tell it to a woman, right? That her honor is associated with her virginity and fidelity when she's married. So in Western, this comes from Western culture. So the idea of honor is directly linked to white European women. During this period, only European women are seen as having honor and virtue, kind of going back to that concept of the mujer villana. Women of color, though, they're not viewed in that same light for a few reasons. So women, European women are viewed as honorable because of that Christian faith that kind of ties them all together. This is why these men married them, right, in Europe, was so they can reproduce and have kids within a legitimate relationship. And remember, we talked about this, the concept of marriage in when we talked about the Middle Ages and how that's kind of constructed through the Catholic Church. Remember, they didn't always own it, and then by the 9th century, they're the ones who define it. So it's definitely connected to Western white European women. Not to say that things are good for them either, and life for them is pretty bad. But these are some of the very few things that they have, I guess, going for them. So within this relationship, women of European white women can transmit property from one generation to the next, which is why you go through this whole concept of marriage, right? You marry a woman and you reproduce, and whatever you have left over goes off to the offsprings, the way Charlemagne did, and every other noble in Europe, right? These women are these entities that can transmit property from one generation to the next one, and if you have kids out of wedlock, they get nothing. As it's been kind of a common tradition in Western Europe, from the Middle Ages. All right. However, women of color, they can never adhere to these ideas. As they're being loaded onto ships, as they're being colonizing the Americas, they can never adhere to these values because many of them are not Christian, right? La Malinche was not Christian. La Malinche was used by Cortez and just reproduced with her, and then just grabbed the kid and took off, right? Women of color are viewed as as people that cannot adhere to the concept of honor and virtue. So most women can probably know this idea because of the whole virgin whore dichotomy. So women, European women, are put within the virgin kind of category, and women of color are put within the whore category, unfortunately. And again, these ideas still kind of shape us today. So women of color during this period are viewed as objects. There's a great article by this author called Antonia Castañeda that looks at the rape of Native American women in California. And as these women are getting raped, they're also being converted into Christians, and they don't quite comprehend why they're being raped when they're being told don't have sex. And these women, in California, as they're being raped, try to comprehend what is happening to their lives with this new religion that's being introduced to them. This historian does a great analysis to kind of showcase as to how women of color are often sexualized in particular ways. And that's what happens, is that you have all these men in California, these Spanish men and mestizo men and so forth, who are living in this kind of frontier region, and they feel like they can do whatever they want to women of color because this is part of that kind of conquest mentality. Not only do you take, somebody's cow, somebody's land, but you also take their women. They're part of this conquest, right? So why they do this is because, yes, they want to be with these women, but also it's a way to castrate the men, right? To emasculate them, their enemies. And this is very much so a Western idea. Many of these Native American women had no concept of rape. So rape is a very Western tradition, if you will, which tells you, right? A lot of times people say, well, everybody rapes. Not necessarily. This is something that comes from a rooted ideology that's based on Western culture. These Native Americans, as they're being raped, they had no idea what was happening or why this was happening to them. They didn't even have a system to deal with it. So it was so foreign to them at this time. So during this whole kind of concept of conquest, these women are essentially viewed as capital, right? It's just property. So when you do rape them, they produce a child, and particularly in the American South, right, when many of these women are raped, these enslaved women that are raped, they're actually producing as slaves, right? As the United States begins to form as a nation, we begin to see how women of color who are raped, particularly African American women who are raped, the status of the child follows the status of the mother, which is almost unheard of, right? In Western culture, we always go through male lines. This is one of the few exceptions where we start going through female lines, and it tells you something about how racialized bodies are viewed at this time. And again, this is the ideological concept. So basically what happens is that you legitimize the rape of women of color in Western culture because of what's happening with the slave trade. So you can see how the slave trade impacts multiple people in different ways. And in this example, it impacts women to the point that we still see these ideas of colored bodies sexualized. If you ever look at Latina bodies, they're sexualized in a particular way. Somebody like Sofia Vergara, if you ever watched that that show, Modern Family, you know, you have a white woman in that show, you have Latina women, and the white woman's very professional, right? The mother kind of character and so forth. But Sofia Vergara is represented as the kind of whore, right? So there you see a great example of the virgin whore dichotomy, where Sofia Vergara is, you know, very sexualized. Her boobs are always popping out, and her dresses are very short, and she's very, you know, kind of hot to trot kind of stereotype. This tends to be a very common, you know, stereotype for women of color. So we see it with African American women, with Asian women, the whole geisha kind of stereotype. And then again, we're not just saying that white women don't go through this either, but they go through a different way. Whereas Latina women and African American women are always over sexualized. Anglo American women are sexualized in a different way. And a lot of it has to do with this particular ideology. All right, so I'll stop it here, and we'll talk about a few more last ideas in the last, hopefully in the last lecture.